Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. This is a follow-up on a previous tutorial concerning porting projects from other platforms, other compositing software platforms and other tutorials into Blender and finding a way to relate the functions of Blender with the functions of other software so that you can, I guess the idea here is that you can build upon your creativity by learning from other people and other platforms and finding a way to port that in. So we're going to take this another step further, just one more step, and I actually have a project that's already put together, and we're going to break it down and look at what goes into it. Now, if you haven't already watched the previous tutorial, you want to go back and watch that because it explains a lot about the setup that we're not going to go over again here in this tutorial. There's quite a bit of a setup into this project. What we're going to look at is animating a texture or a material or a plane object that we can then use in our three-dimensional compositing in the VSE with scene strips. So the idea is that instead of having a text that is stationary and moving through our scene, we want the text to do something, maybe animate in some way. And it's going to look something like this. So hopefully you can see all of that animation in there. I'm screen capturing at 15 frames per second. Hopefully it doesn't drop out some of those very quick frames. But what we're looking at is a text that says glitch, and you can see that the text is animating, that it's actually glitching in the scene. Not only is it glitching on the text itself, but if we look at specific frames here, we can see that there are places where the text is reflecting that same glitch pattern. Let me find a spot here. That's funny. It's keyframing outside of where we want it to be. But if we look at the actual final output of the project here, maybe we can find a spot where we see that happening. Again, this is not going to be in real time as it was before. And one of the reasons is because what we're using is an animated texture. And that animated texture has to cycle through frame by frame within the scenes in which it is rendering from. So we're going to lose a lot of our real-time capability when we do something like this, because we have multiple places where we see that animated texture being rendered within the scenes. But we can see here that we have our glitched kind of text. And we see it not only on the text itself, but we see it in the glow around the text and the glow on the floor, this diffuse sort of lighting, and then in the reflection as well, both forms of reflection that we see on the ground plane. So very advanced kind of procedure that's going on here. Now, speaking of procedure, what this does is it's going to make our project a little bit less procedural than it was before. We're going to have to render out an animation this time rather than depending just on a single frame, a single text frame. Which is going to take a little bit more time, but you're going to find that because we're rendering an OpenGL, that we can render that very, very quickly. So let's take a look at what's going on here. We need to create an animation where we have this glitching occurring. Now, I just want to say at the onset that this is different from a tutorial that we saw on Video Copilot recently, where we saw the glitching happening via an animated displacement. Now, we can do that, and we're going to look at that in another tutorial. But on this one, we're going to look at a single frame kind of superimposition of this glitched sort of image that we're going to place on top of our text. And this is a quicker, easier way to do it, no doubt about it. One person even commented on an example that I gave recently and said, well, the glitch doesn't look very realistic because it would look better if it's just one frame that's being glitched rather than, having an animated. Well, I suppose that's, that person's opinion, and that's fine. But what the original tutorial was showing on the Video Copilot website was that you could use animation. And that the glitching could actually be slow moving and animating and be directional, moving one place to another. So we're going to not look at that. We're going to look at just this one idea here where the glitch is happening on a single frame at a time and find a way to make this. So we're going to need a couple of other things here in order to do this. The first thing that we're going to need is we're going to need some kind of a mask that gives us a sort of a blocky texture that we can animate from. So let's do that very quickly. Let's go to the default view, and we're going to make a new scene. So we'll make a new scene here, and in our scene we need to add a camera. Let me turn this off. We're gonna set this, it doesn't really matter what it is, just by default we set things to GLSL because it's usually what we work in. We're gonna go to the top view and we will align our active camera to that view. And we want it to be relatively centered. We can zoom out just a little bit. We need to get a texture. Now later on when we look at animating images, animating planes, we will be able to use procedural textures within Blender to do that. Right now we can't use the procedural textures to render in OpenGL. So we actually will have to go to our rendered viewport shading. We're going to add a plane. And let's actually go back out here to the texture view so we can see our plane. We're going to scale our plane up so it's outside of the bounds of the camera. And on this, we're going to add a new material. We want this material to be shadeless. And then we're going to add a texture. The texture we're going to add is going to be a cloud texture, and the type of cloud is going to be a cell noise. So this is Blender internal. We want to make this so that it's kind of wider than it is square. We want to make it a little bit more rectangular. At this point we can turn on our rendered view. And also we want to fix our mapping. Right now it's set to UV mapping. We're going to set this to generated. So now we don't see any strange artifacts there. And we're going to set the X to, actually we're going to set the Y, no, we'll set the X to 0.5, so it's twice as wide, a little bit more rectangular. And we want it to be black and white image, so we're going to turn on the color ramp, and on the black side, by default, it has the alpha set to 0. We want to turn that up to 1. And what we want is we want an image where we see some all black, a little bit of all black, and a little bit of all white. And we want it to be fairly balanced out. So we're going to take the black side of our ramp here, and we're going to slide it over. Let's see if we can animate this over, so that we see a few places where we see all black. We want to see only a few places where we see all white as well. So we're going to add another block here, which is going to be this gray texture. We're going to slide it over so we get a little bit more gray in there. And we see a few blocks that are all white, blocks that are kind of in between gray, and a few blocks that are all black. And that gives us the best diversity. Now from here, what we want to do is we want to render one frame. So what we'll do is we will set our resolution up to 100%, and we're just going to render one frame of this. And then we're going to save this frame out. Now I've already saved an image like this, so I'm not going to do it again. In fact, I'm just going to delete this scene. We don't really need the scene. We'll go back to the 3D viewport. We'll put this back to texture rendering. And what we want to do is we want to take this image into a video editor. So let's do that very quickly. And we'll find that scene strip. Now, what you'll see here is an animation that's already been put together. Now, I'm going to kind of recreate this so you can ignore everything that you see down here where we have that animation going on. This is what we're going to be making. Let's start over again. I'm going to add our text picture, our original image, and I've already rendered that out again. So we'll add an image, and it's going to be our text right here. Now, one thing that I did incorrectly is on our text, you would want to leave enough room at the edges to get your blur effect. And I kind of made it a little bit too wide. Now, I found a way to deal with that a little bit later on. But typically, you would want to have your text kind of sit inside of this a little bit. Maybe we can find a way to make our glitch effect not quite so drastic and make that work out. But anyway, we have our text image in here. This is the pre-rendered text that we've been using. Now it says glitch. And what I want to do is I want to make a couple of overlays that will have kind of a separated RGB sort of scale to make our glitch effect. So the first version of this I'm going to duplicate my text. And I'm going to move it up on Y space. And I'm going to add to this a color underneath, a black color that we're going to add this to. And then on this text, I'm going to change it a little bit. I want to crop it very quickly. I'm going to turn on the image crop, and I'm going to crop on the left a few pixels, maybe about 20 pixels, and then on the right I'm going to crop about 20 pixels as well. Maybe I'll go a little bit further. We'll make it 30 and 30. And then what I want to do is I'm going to encapsulate this into a meta strip. And then I'm going to offset it. So the meta strip I'm going to take and I'm going to use the image offset. And I'm going to move it to the left about, let's say, 30 pixels, just a little bit. Negative 30. And that's good. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to change the color. So I'm going to add a modifier, add a curves adjustment, and on the curves adjustment I'm going to take out all of the blue and all of the green. So it leaves us with just red. And then on this strip I'm going to set it to alpha over. And then I'm going to add above this a version of my overlay, my glitch mask. I want this to fill out the whole frame here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my glitch mask to affect my meta strip. So I'm going to turn it off, turn the opacity down, and on my meta strip, which is now set to alpha over, under the modifier stack I'm going to add to it a mask. And this mask is going to use the glitch mask in order to affect it. Now I might want to alter my glitch mask a little bit so it makes it a little bit more stark. So what I'll do is I'll come down here and under my glitch mask I'll add a modifier, add a curves adjustment, and I'm going to bring down the blacks a little bit. And I need to hit refresh sequencer so I can see this. I'll bring up the whites a little bit. And hit refresh sequencer. So I want to remove some parts and end up with just a little bit left here. So something that looks like that will be good. And then I'm going to take all of this and I'm going to encapsulate it. So I'm going to select my glitch mask, my meta strip, and my color. And then I'm going to make that a meta strip. Move that down on a Y space. I'm going to duplicate my meta strip. Then I'm going to jump inside of my second version of it. And on my glitch mask, I'm going to invert it. Now, one way that I could do this is I could just add another curves adjustment and move it above the previous one. And then on this curves adjustment, I'm going to take the darks and move them all the way up and take the whites and move them all the way down. Now we'll have kind of a version that looks like this. Now I may want to edit this so that it looks a little bit more even. So again, we'll slide our curves over. So it looks similar but contrasted to the previous version. And then I'm also going to take my glitch mask, and something I want to do at the onset is I want to flip it. I'm going to flip this on the X and the Y axis. Actually, I think yes, that's fine. And we'll refresh the sequencer. So it looks kind of like that. Now I don't like how it's really focusing on the same quadrant down here on the left, so I might go back and on my glitch, instead of flipping it on the X and Y, I'll just flip it on the Y. See what that gets us. So now we have something that looks like that. Now for my meta strip, where I have this red glitch pattern, I want to change it so that instead of being offset on the x-axis 30, negative 30, I want to offset it 30. And then I also want to go to the coloring for this strip. And I have it set so that it's all red. I want to take the reds, and I'm going to move the reds all the way down. And on this version, I want to take the blues, and I want to move the blues all the way up. So now I've got kind of a different version of my glitch pattern. So now I've if I tab out, I have two versions of my metastrip. Now the top one, which is blue, I'm going to take this one and I'm going to set it to add. So now it's adding to the version underneath, just like this. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a version of my text and I'm going to move it up here, and I'm going to add to this a color curve. So we'll add a curves adjustment, and I'm going to take out all of the blues and all of the reds and leave it green. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to set it to add blend mode. And I'm also going to turn down the opacity a little bit to 0.5. So I have this kind of a form left over. And I probably will do something a little bit different with this one. I'm going to take this and I'm going to flip it on the x-axis. So the words are actually in reverse. It's actually reversed from that. So I'm left with this kind of an image, this kind of a form. I'm going to take all of this, and I'm going to select all of it, and I'm going to put it into a metastrip. Move this down on the y-axis. And above that, I'm going to add another version of my glitch mask. So I'll grab that glitch mask again. We'll stretch this out. Then I'm going to make a duplicate version of that. Now on my duplicate version, I'm going to flip it on the x and y axis. And then I'm going to take the modifier stack here. I'm going to add to it a curves adjustment. I'm going to invert it. Then on this version of the glitch mask, I'm going to set the opacity. It's going to be set to blend mode cross. I'm going to set the opacity to 0.5. So I'm left with this kind of new image where I've crossed my images together. If I take this away, you can see this is what the original looks like, and this is what the composite one looks like. And then I'm going to take these two, and I'm going to put them into a metastrip. And then I'm going to add to this a curves adjustment, and I'm going to increase the contrast. So I'm going to get to a point again where I have some examples of white, some examples of total black. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this strip and I'm going to flip it on the y-axis, so it's different. Maybe I'll even flip it on the x-axis as well. So it's very, very contrasted to the version that we have underneath. Then I'm going to turn it off. And on my metastrip, I'm going to take my metastrip and my metastrip with the glitch in it. And I'll move those up on y-axis. And I'll add underneath this another color. I'm going to set my metastrip with my glitch pattern in it, my RGB version here, to alpha over. And I'm going to add to it a mask. And the mask is going to be my metastrip 18 up here. And I want to contrast this quite a bit more. Let me go into that. And we'll bring up the whites. Refresh. Bring in the blacks a little bit. Refresh. Do that again. And I'm not sure I like what we're coming up with here. I might want to add a bit of a contrast curve, reverse contrast curve. See if we can get a little bit more, that might be interesting. Let's see what that does. That's debatable whether or not this is improving it or making it worse. We'll play around until we get something a little bit more even. Let me turn this off. I've actually come back to a place where it looks almost identical. Let me get rid of this mask here for a second, see what it looks like. You know what I might do, actually? Let me get rid of this mask. I might duplicate this. And on the top version, I might flip it on the x-axis. And I wonder what happens if we set this to subtract. That's interesting. I kind of like that. What happens if we set it to multiply? Huh. I kind of like what we're getting here. I'm going to, let me turn this off, put it back to cross again. Make another version of this. I'm going to put this into a meta strip. Make another version of it. You can really play around with this and do whatever you want. I'm going to set this one to multiply. I'll tab out of that. Another tab out of that. And on this version, I'm going to set this one to subtract. Tab out of that. And then I'm going to set this one on top to add. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah, let's go with this. This is really, really neat. And we'll take all of this and we'll put it into a meta strip. So you can play around until you get you know, a kind of image that you really like, something that looks interesting to you. I think I'm going to take this and I'm going to add to it a little bit of a brightness to it. So we'll maybe multiply it 1.5 just to kind of brighten it up a little bit. So this is what our text is going to look like when it's glitched. Now, what we want to do is we want to take this and animate it on and off. So let's say we turn it on over here. I'm going to go to the opacity, set it to cross, and we're going to set the opacity down to 0. And then I'm going to move over one frame and set the opacity up to 1. Insert a keyframe. We'll move over maybe 2 more keyframes and set the opacity to 1 and hit insert keyframe. And then we'll step over another frame and set it to 0. So the idea here is that as we move through the animation, we would go to this point where we have this glitch will turn on and then turn off again. And I would set in some keyframes to make it turn on and off at various points. Then what I would do is I would render this out as an animation, as an AVI or some kind of video format. And then I can use this inside of my other scenes where I have my blur and my reflection. So let's go look at that. I've already rendered something like this out. Let's go to the let's see, we want to find our text blur. And you can see here that if I set this to scene render size, I've already added this animation in. And you can see what's happening. I've added to it the same Gaussian blur that I had before. I set this up to 15 pixels blur, plus the adjustment layer to turn up my multiply value to 2 to give it some brightness. And it turns on and off. Now, in my original one, I found that my blur kind of went outside of the bounds of my frame here. So what I did is I added this overlay of my original text blur, just a single frame of it. And let me set this to cross very quickly. And I turned up the multiply quite a bit, and then I used it as an overlay set to multiply so that it would cut off some of that blurred section that gets cropped off on the end. So it keeps all of the blur within the bounds of the frame. This is not an ideal way to do it. What I should have done is I should have made my text a little bit smaller so I had a lot of room to play with. Then what I would do is I would just render this out as a pass, which would be a blur pass. And then I do the same thing, very similar thing with my reflection. So if I go to my text reflect, very similar. I add my animation in there, and then I put my I have my little fall off wipe effect that I had before, and I just duplicated it so that it would go through the range of 120 frames. And then I rendered this out as well. So I put in my animation, I set my Gaussian blur to be what it was before. In this case, it is 2 pixels X and 8 pixels Y. And then I set my overlay, and I also flipped my animation so that it would be upside down. Then I rendered this out. So now I've got animated passes that match my single frame passes from before. Now all I need to do is I go into my project, to the default view here, and I go to my strip scenes where I have everything occurring. So if I go to, for example, I go to my text strip. We'll go to the camera view. Turn on the only background and world. Now what I did is I go to this object inside of my text strip, the text plane here, and on both of my for both of my images, I have my blurred image for the glow and I have my text image, I added versions that are the animation. So I added a texture here, which is the animation, and I set it to 120 frames. Auto refresh, starts on frame 1. And now it will play that animation through. And likewise, I put the blur one on there for the glow effect. So this is the blurred animation that I rendered out, set to 120 frames, starts at frame 1, auto refresh. And I set this one to add, blend mode, and the color is set down to 0.3 to give me that glow. And when I play this back in real time, it plays back my animation. So you can see how this works. So again, it's less procedural, but once I've done this on one of these planes, in fact, I could have done it on my original scene. If I go to the original scene, you see everything's updated there. I could have done it for everything here, not only on my text, but also on my reflection, and then also on my blur passes, and it will automatically update everywhere. So in that sense, it is still procedural. Now when I go to my, my composite, let this load in, we'll see that everything is now updated. And I can see everything in play here, and I can render out my final animation. So we can use animated textures in order to accomplish animation using this sort of technique. So image planes with animated textures being applied in the same way within the video sequence editor, much like a two-dimensional After Effects composite. You can do this sort of thing here as well in Blender. Now, on the next tutorial, we're going to look at a way in which we can use procedural textures to animate things within a scene using displacement. We can actually do that within a scene and accomplish a lot of effects that we see in other tutorials on other platforms via that method as well. So anyway, just a new idea for you to play around with. You can create sort of this glitch texture within the VSE and then animate it on and off and render out that animation and use your animation within the scene. It's kind of like a pre-composition, pre-comping something, then taking that pre-comp, that pre-rendered form into your scene structure and use the scene strips to composite together your final output. So there you have it. Good luck with this idea, and I wish all of you happy blending.